All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Um, Today, the libraries will be giving a presentation on the NIH's 2024 Public Access Policy, as well as talking about the Nelson Memo and a little bit about the 2023 Data Management and Sharing Policy as well. I'm the Scholarly Communications Librarian, Matt Fulse, and today I'm co-presenting with our Research Services Librarian, Sharon Duffy. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel. We are also monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and we will answer them as they come in. But we'll also try to reserve some time for Q&A at the end. All right. Here's our outline for today's presentation, doing some background info as well as a timeline, and then digging into the 2024 NIH Public Access Policy, talking about the 2023 NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy, and then Sharon's going to take over and show you all how to comply with these policies. So background information. Just off the top, I want to say this is a dense presentation with a lot of information. So before we really dig into this stuff, kind of keep this central thesis that you see on the screen in mind. These new policies come at no cost to NIH awardees or to the researchers and authors of scientific publications. However, there is a higher threshold of compliance, planning, and judicious journal selection required. All right, so here's our timeline. We start 20 years ago in 2003 with the very first data sharing policy from the NIH. And then just 5 years later, we get the first public access policy from the NIH. And then just another 5 years after that, we get the first Office of Science and Technology Policy Memo, also known as the Holdren Memo. And this policy required that all NIH-funded peer-reviewed articles be freely available after a maximum embargo of just 12 months. 10 years later, we get a second OSTP memo release called the Nelson Memo. This was an increased push to enhance public access of federally funded, peer-reviewed scholarly publications. Accordingly, the NIH proposed its most recent data management and sharing policy in 2023. And not long after, the NIH published its 2024 Public Access Policy, which is the primary point of today's discussion. Additionally, there has been a critical update to that 2024 policy, which is really the meat of today's presentation. So, the Nelson Memo, I've already talked about this a little bit, but there's some more to say. In 2022, the then acting director of the OSTP, Dr. Alondra Nelson, released the memo entitled Ensuring Free, Immediate, and Equitable Access to Federally Funded Research. The aim of this memo was to override the 2008 Public Access Policy's 12-month embargo and provide free, immediate access to federally funded publications. The 2024 Public Access Policy embodies this by doing exactly that, eliminating that embargo. So here's some key definitions provided from the NIH, specifically what is an author-accepted manuscript, which is the author's final version that has been accepted for journal publication and includes all revisions resulting from the peer review process, including all associated tables, graphics, and supplemental material. And then the definition for the official date of publication, which is the date on which the final published article is first made available in its final edited form, whether in print or electronic, i.e. online format. And on the left, you'll see I've created a little infographic on the 3 stages of sort of this process. An initial submission is often what we call a preprint. It is that work in progress, which has undergone no review, that has been submitted to the journal. And then we reach the stage of what we call an author-accepted manuscript, which is when that initial manuscript has undergone peer review and is now acceptable for submission to PubMed Central. Finally, we get what is called a final published article, sometimes referred to as the version of record, but it is the journal and publisher's authoritative copy. So some other key terms I want to talk about, I won't just define for you. You can find them at the link just below, is what a final published article is. I sort of loosely defined it, and technically what the NIH defines as a journal. And a few things to note, though, is that there is no official definition for the official date of acceptance for a manuscript. The window of time to self-archive an author-accepted manuscript in PubMed Central is that window from the date of acceptance to the official date of publication, and that the NIH continues to encourage authors to publish NIH-funded research in reputable journals. So let's talk about this new NIH policy. So what's the purpose behind it? Well, the NIH is attempting to enhance public access to publicly funded research to better responsible stewardship of science, to accelerate research and collaboration, and to help patients and providers make more informed decisions about their care. So the scope of the 2024 Public Access Policy applies to any awardee of any NIH funding, regardless of the amount and how it's awarded. Additionally, the awardees bear final responsibility for how funds are used and for compliance with the 2024 Public Access Policy, as well as the 2023 Data Management and Sharing Policy. If even a cent of your NIH funding is put towards production of data or scholarly published works, the buck stops with you, even if you have no other direct role. The basic requirements of the new 2024 policy is that author-accepted manuscripts must be submitted to PubMed Central by the official date of publication with no embargo, and it must always be free to submit to PubMed Central. You must also include an acknowledgement of NIH funding in the author-accepted manuscript and the final published article. So government licensing rights. When you accept NIH funding, you provide the NIH with a license and rights to your author-accepted manuscript. You aren't giving up your rights to the final published article. Additionally, some journals or publishers can submit on your behalf to PubMed Central, but they cannot charge you for doing so if they are depositing the author-accepted manuscript. So what's this big change? Sorry. So what's this big change? In April of 2025, the new administration accelerated the compliance date from December 31st, 2025 to July 1st, 2025. And as of this presentation, if your manuscript is accepted for publication after peer review, then this policy applies to you. So the 2023 NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy. So why even talk about this at all? Well, in many ways, it's tied to this 2024 Public Access Policy. The window to publish relevant supplemental figures, graphs, or data relevant to the replication of the published article are the same window for self-archiving in PubMed Central, the author-accepted manuscript. To repeat, that window being the time from that official date of acceptance to the official date of publication. Additionally, the data must be available without embargo, and it does not matter the dollar amount of the awardee. Everyone granted NIH funding must comply. The major difference between the two policies is that all data or supplemental information generated from a grant must be publicly available by the end of the award's life cycle and archived in a data repository. At this link at the top of the slide, you would find where to find the NIH's recommendations for data repositories. So some key terms that are outlined in this policy, I'll just share the data management and sharing plan quote, a plan describing the data management, preservation, and sharing of scientific data and accompanying metadata. So you might ask what any of those terms mean, and you'll find them explicitly outlined at this link on the right, but the terms we're looking for are metadata, data management, data sharing, and then what constitutes scientific data. So a quick recap, the first data management sharing policy released about 20 years ago. And in the intervening years, the NIH has released other data policies before finally implementing this 2023 DMS policy. It's linked here to read in more detail, but I've also listed loosely the topics that are covered here, mostly about how data is expected to be shared, how long it should be available, where to share it, and that definition, submission and assessment of DMS plans and how the NIH will evaluate them, plan templates, elements, and limits, and other topics like persistent unique identifiers like ORCIDs, data security, and sharing timelines. So now I'm going to be handing it over to my colleague, Sharon Duffy, who's going to give you all some great information on how to comply with the 2024 Public Access Policy.
Okay. All right. So I'm Sharon Duffy. I am the Research Services Librarian, and I am going to finish our presentation. All right, so Matthew has given us a good explanation of the new NIH Public Access Policy. And now I'm going to walk through some questions that researchers might have when determining how to comply with it, kind of the application of the policy. All right, so the first question is, does the new policy apply to my paper? And if the answer is yes, if it is a peer-reviewed manuscript, if it was accepted for publication by a journal on or after July 1st, 2025, which is now every day going forward, and if it arises from any direct funding from an NIH grant, even if it's partial funding. So it's important to note that every single article going forward that arises from your NIH grant and meets these other criteria is subject to this policy. It doesn't matter if the PI is an author on the article or not. If even 1 penny of your NIH funding was used, then the new policy must be followed. And I want to note that this applies to existing federal grant money. So you may already have this NIH grant. So any publications accepted going forward are covered by this policy. There is additional information available for other situations, including institutional training, career development, and related awards, and also for publications that are supported by shared resources. And we've provided links here for additional information on those situations. All right, next question. What and when do I have to submit to PubMed Central? So as Matt outlined, the policy requires that at a minimum, the author-accepted manuscript be made available in PubMed Central by the official date of publication. And I've highlighted those things in red on the slide. This is the what, and this is the when. So you may be wondering if you are allowed to post your manuscript, given that any publisher agreements that you may have signed. Articles generated by NIH grant money and all federal grants fall under a government use license, which states that the NIH, quote, reserves a royalty-free, non-exclusive, and irrevocable right to reproduce, publish, or otherwise use the work for federal purposes and to authorize others to do so. This federal purpose license is not new, and it is not an expansion of the government's existing legal authority. This authority has existed since at least 1976. Invoking this license simplifies the compliance for authors and institutions because it clarifies what has been the case for many years, namely that the rights needed to comply with the public access policies are secured the moment an article is created, regardless of whether authors retain these rights later on. The license provides clear language that supports deposit and reuse of research outputs, allows all federal agencies to achieve uniformity, reduces the risk of noncompliance for grant recipients, and maximizes the return on investment for taxpayers. It acts as a, quote, prior license, and authors will still retain rights to their research products. So in other words, when you accept federal grant money, your work is covered by this license and can be deposited in PubMed Central. These rights cannot be overridden by a publisher agreement later in the research process. And again, I'm referring to the author-accepted manuscript, not the journal's final version of the article. So it is very important that authors are transparent with journals and publishers when submitting their articles to ensure they know that the NIH has a right to make the author-accepted manuscript and all the supporting data publicly available by the official date of publication. So now we need to discuss publisher embargoes. All right, so let's review a couple common publishing models to see how the new policy will impact the terms of these agreements. All right, so a common one is gold open access. In this, authors are required to pay an article processing charge, or an APC. And in return, the final published article is fully and openly available without any embargo. And many times the publisher will handle posting this final published article in PubMed Central. However, as a note, now that this is a critical step for the authors to maintain their grant funding, it is best to ensure that this, as the author, that this happens to ensure that you stay compliant. And in this model, the author typically retains their copyright, usually with some form of Creative Commons license. So essentially, if you're gold open access, you essentially have no major changes with this new policy. You've paid for the final published article to be made available with no embargo. Our recommendation here is that you just ensure that it does get posted to PubMed Central by the time it gets published online by the publisher, because now that's a critical step for you. They used to have a window of time, but now it's got to be in that tight window by the time it's available online. All right, so now green open access. In this model, authors do not pay an APC fee. The author-accepted manuscript can be posted in PubMed Central or other repositories, but there has usually been an embargo before the authors are allowed to do so. And also, authors are self-archiving in this model, so depositing in PubMed Central becomes their responsibility to maintain compliance. And typically in this model, the copyright has been signed over to the publisher and the author gives up rights to their work. However, remember, the federal purpose license now allows the NIH to make an immediate repository deposit of the work. So this creates what we're going to call a contradictory policy environment. And it is not known exactly how publishers will handle these conflicts regarding both the embargo and the copyright. But this is definitely your right to publish or to post the author-accepted manuscript into PubMed Central, regardless of what the publisher thinks you can do. We are, Matthew and I are monitoring publisher announcements. We are monitoring listservs and chatter in the open access community and keeping an eye on how publishers are responding to this new mandate. So we're staying on top of it. All right, so what should authors do under this new policy environment? Well, first, authors need to fully research and understand the publishing policies of a journal before they submit their article that arises from NIH funding. Matt mentioned earlier on in the presentation that this new policy creates a higher threshold for authors regarding planning and judicious journal selection to ensure compliance, and this is where some of that additional work will be required. So when reviewing publisher agreements, some key terms to look for are things like green open access and self-archiving, as these are typically the cost-free models. There are publishers who do allow for zero embargo deposits of articles without any fees. The libraries have resources available to help you find them, including Cabals is one of our newer products that will help you identify potential journals that fit your needs. And there are also some free resources, including the Directory of Open Access Journals and the PubMed Central Journal List, where you can identify journals with no embargo. And these links are provided and the slides are being shared and are available so you can access these resources. Utilizing one of the library's existing fee waiver agreements with publishers can also enable authors to avoid charges and avoid embargoes. So we've worked out agreements with some publishers that essentially give you gold open access for free because of our negotiations. So be sure to click on that link and learn more details about those. Overall, authors need to shop around and avoid journals with extremely high APCs if there has not been money set aside in the budget for publishing costs. And I'll talk more about costs in a moment. Now, there is the possibility that publishers will try to steer authors to the paid open access model when they learn that the work requires zero embargo due to the NIH policy. But again, the NIH is very clear that compliance with this new policy will not require paying an APC. You may need to find a different journal, but you are not required to pay. All right, so how do I inform publishers that NIH funds were used for my work? So it's very important that authors are transparent when submitting their article to a journal that the author-accepted manuscript is subject to this new policy. The NIH has provided some sample language to include both with the article submission and when posting your author-accepted manuscript on PubMed Central. You should include something like, this manuscript is the result of funding in whole or in part by the NIH. It is subject to the NIH Public Access Policy. Through acceptance of this federal funding, NIH has been given a right to make this manuscript publicly available in PubMed Central upon the official date of publication, as defined by NIH. So it's very important that you are upfront about that when making your submission. Okay, next question. Can I use grant money to pay these publishing costs? Yes. At this time, NIH does allow for money to be budgeted for anticipated publishing costs. There is some specific language in the Code of Federal Regulations that specifically mentions article processing charges as an allowable fee. Assuming that the publication reports work that is supported by the federal government and that the charges are applied to all publications, regardless of funding source. So again, direct funds may be used to pay an APC. Researchers need to be mindful of this when submitting their budget proposals. So again, that comes down to planning and looking at journals earlier in the process. Now, grant funds are not allowed to be used for depositing the author-accepted manuscript. Again, this is the version that falls under that federal purpose license, and authors can self-archive at no cost. All right, a word about the role of institutional repositories. The policy allows for author-accepted manuscripts to also be deposited in institutional repositories. This is an optional step and is not a replacement for the requirement of depositing in PubMed Central. This is in addition to that, and it's not required, but it's an option. So LSU Digital Scholar is our institutional repository, and Matt and I oversee the faculty publications collections. So we can post your author-accepted manuscript. You can email us directly. Our emails are on our slides, or there's also the Digital Scholar email that you can contact us to start this process. Again, it's not a substitute, but it is an additional option that will boost the visibility of your manuscript, and we highly recommend that you do so. Again, this will only be the author-accepted manuscript. All right, next question. How do I submit my paper to PubMed Central? Well, now that we have fully established that authors are required to deposit those manuscripts in PubMed Central, let's talk a little bit about that process. Again, start by reviewing the agreement with your publisher to identify who is responsible for this step. There are several routes available, and you should choose the method that's most appropriate given your agreement. I have them available on the next slide, and I'm gonna talk about them in a little more detail. So method C is the one where authors self-archive. So this is a good choice because ultimately it's the awardees who are responsible for meeting compliance, not the publishers. All right, so here's the table from the NIH. I just want to point out that each method offers routes for depositing either the final published article, that would be methods A and B, and then generally it's the publisher who is going to be doing it for the authors, and this is the author accepted manuscript. So here's method C, where authors can do it themselves. But I want to point out that in all the scenarios, on all four of them, the ultimately responsible party is you as the NIH awardee. There's plenty of information on the NIH website, step-by-step instructions. You can also reach out to the libraries for assistance with this step. All right, now how do I report my publications to NIH? The requirement for verifying compliance is inclusion of something called the PubMed Central reference number, the ID number, at the end of the full citation in any applications, proposals, or reports to the NIH. And this number is generated when you deposit your manuscript in PubMed Central. And this is how they're going to track compliance. So here's a sample citation. So you have your regular citation, all the information, and then you will include this extra information to prove, kind of like your receipt, that you submitted it to PubMed Central. And you will use the tool in My NCBI to report your papers and also to track your compliance. And that's a free tool through that you can use for the government. All right, so here's a review of author requirements under the new policy. Okay, so you need to acknowledge that NIH funding was used in your work when submitting your manuscript to the journal and in the posted manuscript. So that's a requirement. You have to submit. So hopefully you come away with this message. The author-accepted manuscript needs to be submitted to PubMed Central by the official date of publication. And then you need to report All papers that arise from your grant must be reported when submitting applications, proposals, and reports to the NIH. Anything that's related to the same project and the same work. You must include that PubMed Central reference number. And again, even partially funded work must be reported. All right, so enforcement. Here's a few ways that an author could be non-compliant with this policy. So, failure to deposit your author-accepted manuscript into PubMed Central by the official date of publication is non-compliance with this brand new policy. Failure to acknowledge federal funding in your manuscript is considered non-compliance. Failure to provide evidence of compliance in your applications, proposals, and awards is a violation of the terms and conditions of the NIH award and is considered non-compliance. So that's where you need that PMCID. And non-compliance may be considered by the NIH when making future funding decisions. So this is essentially important information. All right, and then finally, here's just a researcher checklist of tools that you can be using now to help achieve compliance with federal grants. So the first is ORCID IDs. These are now required for all federal grant submissions. This is a persistent identifier that allows you to gather all of your scholarly work into a single location. As an author, you can put everything with that same number. So especially if you have a common name, you won't get your work confused with anybody else's. And then this is connected to your ERA Commons personal profile. And then your ORCID can be used to populate your science CV. And this is a tool that's used to generate your NIH approved format for your biosketch. And this is also in the My NCBI tool. And then your biosketch is a document that highlights the qualifications of key personnel for proposed grant projects. And again, all of this can be tied together and done automatically on the My NCBI. So use of these tools was going to be required by the end of May of this year, but that's been postponed for now. However, it is a good idea to make sure you are using these tools for federal grants so that you're ready when they become required. And you can reach out to the libraries if you would like any assistance with learning how to use these free tools. All right, so that's the end of our presentation. We have some information or some QR codes here. The first is a survey just to help us collect metrics on our presentations. You can follow us on Instagram, and you can sign up for library emails to keep aware of future sessions and presentations that we'll be having. Again, Matt and I are monitoring the situation. We will be sharing updates on our resource guides and anything important through our emails. To keep updated with this changing environment. And you can reach out to us at any time with any questions with where to publish a journal, questions about compliance with the policy. We are here to support you in that end of your research. So thank you for coming. Are there any questions? Oh yeah, we have a question in the room.
Thank you. So I have just a few.
Okay.
The first one is, do book chapters with DOIs for this?
The question is, do book chapters with DOIs count as a publication? Is it a peer reviewed? I would say probably not. Right, because one of the requirements was peer reviewed. Do you think?
So even if it's hosted in a journal with a DOI, it might be hard to hear me, but I would say that a book chapter, even if it's hosted online, if it hasn't undergone peer review specifically, no, it shouldn't. I wouldn't that.
Okay, good, perfect. Are there any special considerations for European journal or so US journals versus international journals that we need to be worried about?
No, it applies to any journal. It's not related to the journal or the publication. It's related to the source of the funding. So the NIH doesn't care where you publish it. They just want that author accepted manuscript to be made available. Oh, so anyway, for people on the chat, or on the Zoom, the question was, does it matter if it's a European-based journal or a US journal? And it does not. It's only the source of the funding.
But, so preprints, do we have to worry about those having a
No, preprint, the question is, do preprints count? Preprints as defined on Matt's graphic are not peer reviewed. Where is that slide? There it is. Yeah, and that's why we put this graphic in here, because I think that really helps delineate where we're talking about different versions of an article throughout the publication cycle. So we're starting with the preprint. That one does not count. It's that next step after it's undergone peer review and the publisher has said, congratulations, your publication has been accepted into our publication and we will, and we will publish it. That version will be the one that you have to deposit if they're not going to. And this often looks like just like a Word document.
I've had papers where I've uploaded everything or and then sometimes they magically appear, but now I know I can magically appear.
Okay, all right, yes, but you are responsible now. And again, you look at your author agreement or your publisher agreement, but you can trust but verify that that gets posted because now you could be non-compliant if the publisher doesn't do their job. You are ultimately the one responsible. So it's recommended that you obviously will have a copy of that author accepted manuscript. And if you're not seeing it get posted, or, you can take action and do it yourself or follow up with the publisher, but you have the ability to do that yourself for free.
Just as we use these terms really specifically, because these are the terms that NIH uses.
Okay.
This is from the federal government. So the publishers and journals might use specific language that doesn't one-to-one align with these three terms. And it's a shame they don't align with how the federal government chooses to. I mean, obviously outside of the US, they may not have to comply, but so sometimes you'll go to a journal and they'll use slightly different terms for each of these three things. But we wanted to be clear that this is how the NIH use these, like explicitly uses and defines these terms, which is why we chose to use them and not something that more is publisher or like corporate aligned language.
Yes,
If
yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, we pulled these from the NIH policy and defined them very specifically following their exact wording.
Last question, I guess. Thank y'all. The DSMP tool that you have.
Oh, yes.
Just yesterday, our PPR got sent back and they were like, you need to do this. I was like, what is that? But yes.
Excellent. All right. So there was a comment about the data management, the DMP tool required for those data management and sharing plans. And that does tie into this because the data that supports this specific article is also required to be fully shared and made available at the same time. It could be in a repository. It doesn't have to be in PubMed Central, but there has to be publicly available at the same time. So it's kind of getting caught up into that same realm. The data and the supporting figures and all that kind of stuff is also covered in this new policy, not just the manuscript. It's sort of like the manuscript and all supporting documents. In fact, it says right here, all associated tables, graphics, and materials. All right, very good. So again, this recording will be made available. The slides will be made available. We will keep everybody updated on any changes, and feel free to reach out at any time with any questions or assistance. We are here to help. All right, have a good day. Thank you for attending.